It began on a night that was never meant to be remembered, yet somehow became impossible to forget. The grand hall of the Carlton estate shimmered with golden light, the kind of radiance that doesn't simply illuminate a room but tries to remind everyone inside of their place. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead like frozen waterfalls, each droplet of light reflecting champagne flutes, diamond necklaces, and the guarded smiles of people who had never known hunger. At the far end of the hall stood a glossy black Steinway grand piano, polished to such perfection that the reflections on its surface looked more real than the world around it. The man who owned this world, Benedict Wellingham III, was a billionaire by fortune, by birth, and by the arrogance that had been passed down through generations like a family heirloom. He wore his wealth like a tailored suit, not just on his body, but in the way he walked, the way he looked at people, and, most of all, in the way he laughed. His laughter was not the kind that warmed a room. It was the kind that drew lines, separating those who belonged from those who didn't. It was during one of those high-society nights, amid murmured deals and forced laughter, that the challenge slipped from his lips. A challenge born from boredom, sharpened with cruelty. He gestured to the piano as though it were a prop, an ornament for his amusement. And then he said the words that would echo far beyond those glittering walls. "If you can play this piano, I'll marry you." It was absurd, scandalous even, but that was the point. The crowd laughed. Oh, how they laughed! But their laughter swelled to something darker when their eyes fell on the man who had caught Benedict's attention. A janitor, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room, mop still damp in his hand. His name was Elijah Turner. He was there not as a guest, not as entertainment, but as part of the invisible machinery that kept the night clean, polished, and perfect. He had been sweeping the marble floor when Benedict noticed him, and something in the billionaire's smirk made the room tilt. Perhaps it was the way Elijah carried himself, not with the stoop of someone who knew his place, but with a quiet, almost dangerous calm. The invitation, no, the mockery, was repeated. "Come on, Turner. Show us what you've got. Play this piano, and I'll make you my bride." The words dripped with irony, but the intent was clear. The challenge wasn't about music. It was about humiliation. Every eye in the room turned to Elijah. Most expected him to shake his head, mutter an excuse, and return to his work. That was the role he was meant to play in their world, background noise. But Elijah didn't move away. He set the mop aside, his gaze fixed on the piano like a man staring at an open door to somewhere he hadn't been in years. The billionaire laughed again, louder this time, feeding on the tension. "What's the matter? Afraid you'll break it?" And in that moment, something shifted in the air. Elijah took a slow step forward, the faint squeak of his work shoes echoing against the marble floor. The crowd's amusement turned into a restless murmur. No one knew what was about to happen, but everyone could feel it. The night had stopped being ordinary. When Elijah's hands finally touched the keys, the room fell into a silence so deep it felt like a held breath. The first sound that rose from the piano wasn't a note. It was a confession. A single, aching tone that hung in the air, trembling, as though it carried the weight of years that no one in that room had lived but Elijah had endured. The wealthy crowd froze, their expressions caught between surprise and something they didn't want to name. Recognition. Recognition that beauty could come from places they had been taught to ignore. Elijah's fingers didn't just press the keys. They searched them, like a man returning to an old friend after a long absence, unsure if he would be welcomed. Each touch was deliberate, his hands moving with a grace that didn't belong to the uniform he wore. The music began to unfurl like a memory, delicate at first, then swelling, filling the high ceilings with something the chandeliers could never match. Raw, unfiltered soul. Benedict's smirk faltered. He had expected clumsy fumbling, a quick surrender, maybe a few awkward notes that would seal the janitor's humiliation. Instead, he found himself watching a performance that demanded silence, not because of politeness, but because to speak over it felt like a sin. The guests shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't supposed to happen. The invisible man in the room had suddenly become its center, and the music was pulling them into a place where their titles, fortunes, and pedigrees meant nothing. Elijah's playing was not flawless in a technical sense, it was better than that. It was alive. Each note seemed to carry the scent of rain on rusted tin roofs, the hum of old church choirs, the echo of laughter in small kitchens. It carried pain too, deep, private pain that could only be spoken through the trembling of strings. And then, Elijah closed his eyes. When he did, the music shifted. The cautious beauty of the opening gave way to something more dangerous, more intimate. It was as if he had opened a door that even he hesitated to walk through, and yet, now that it was open, there was no going back. His fingers blurred across the keys, drawing from them a storm of sound, a cascade that seemed to rise from the very floor. Benedict tried to mask his discomfort with a chuckle, but it came out hollow. He looked around, searching for someone else still laughing, but the room had been seized by something ancient, something beyond money or status. Even the waiters, halfway to serving glasses of champagne, stood frozen, their trays trembling in their hands. For the first time that night, Benedict's own rules no longer mattered. Elijah was rewriting them with every chord. The final sequence of notes rose high, like the last cry of a bird in flight, and then silence. A silence so thick it felt physical. Elijah didn't look up right away. He kept his hands resting on the keys as though he needed to hold on to the last note for just a moment longer before letting it go. When he finally lifted his gaze, he wasn't smiling, he wasn't triumphant. He was simply steady. And for reasons no one could quite explain, that was what made it unforgettable. For a long moment after the last note faded, Elijah didn't move. His fingers still rested lightly on the keys, and the crowd still held its collective breath, as though some invisible thread connected them all to him. In that silence, he could almost hear the sound of another room, another time years ago, before the uniform, before the mop bucket, before the stares that told him what he was worth. He saw his mother's hands first. They were strong hands, shaped by work in the cotton fields, calloused yet capable of the most delicate grace when they touched the old upright piano in their small Louisiana church. That piano wasn't glossy like this one. It had missing keys, and the wood was cracked, but to Elijah, it was the closest thing to a cathedral. It was where his mother taught him that music wasn't just something you played. It was something you lived through, something you survived with. "You don't play for applause," she used to say, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You play because it's the only way to tell the truth without using words." Back then, Elijah's world was small. The church, the school, the little apartment with peeling paint. But when he sat at that piano, he felt infinite. And his mother, God, she had a way of making every wrong note feel like part of the song. She'd lean over him, guiding his fingers with her own, not forcing, just reminding him to listen. Not to the instrument, but to himself. The years that followed weren't kind. His mother's illness came fast and without mercy. Medical bills swallowed what little they had. The piano was sold to a stranger in another town, and with it went the last piece of his childhood. Elijah stopped playing, not because he didn't love music anymore, but because it hurt too much to touch the keys without hearing her voice. Life pushed him into corners. He worked odd jobs, learned to keep his head down, learned to be invisible. He swept floors in diners, carried boxes in warehouses, fixed leaky pipes in strangers' basements. Music became a thing he carried inside but never let out. The world didn't seem interested in the songs of a poor black janitor. And then, years later, fate, if you could call it that, placed him at the Carlton estate. The job was supposed to be temporary. The rich guests barely noticed him, except when they wanted something. But the piano noticed him. Every time he passed it, he felt the same pull, the same ache he had felt as a boy standing beside his mother. That night, when Benedict called him out, Elijah almost walked away. He knew it was a setup, a joke at his expense. But something in him refused to play the role written for him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was his mother's voice, still whispering after all these years. "Tell the truth, Elijah." So he walked to the piano, and as his fingers found the keys, all the years between then and now collapsed into nothing. The marble floors became worn church steps. The crystal chandeliers turned into flickering candles. The air smelled not of perfume and champagne, but of old hymnals and rain leaking through the roof. He played for her. For the woman who taught him that music was bigger than the room you played it in. For the boy who had been told to be quiet. For the man who had been made to disappear in plain sight. When the last note faded, Elijah lifted his hands slowly, as if returning a sacred relic to its place. His chest felt heavy, but it wasn't with fear anymore. It was with the weight of everything he had carried to that moment. He stood, nodded once to the piano as though thanking it, and stepped back. He didn't wait for applause. Applause wasn't why he had played. Across the room, Benedict Wellingham III sat stiff in his chair, a thin smile plastered on his face. But his eyes betrayed something no one there had ever seen in him before: uncertainty. Benedict Wellingham III had never been in a room he couldn't control. His fortune, his connections, his name, they were weapons disguised as privilege, and he had used them so long that their power felt like the natural order of things. Yet now, sitting there with Elijah's music still echoing faintly in the corners of the hall, he felt smaller. The laughter he had expected from his guests never came. Instead, there was that strange hush, a tension like the room itself had shifted, the kind of shift you couldn't put into words but could feel in your bones. People were looking at him differently. They weren't leaning in for his approval or waiting for his next clever remark. They were thinking about something else entirely, and Benedict hated not being the center of their thoughts. He forced a chuckle, leaning back in his chair with calculated nonchalance. "Well," he said loudly, "I suppose you've got a little more talent than I thought, Turner." The words were dressed in condescension, but even to his own ears they sounded weak, like an afterthought. Elijah didn't reply. He simply picked up his mop, wrung it out, and returned to the patch of marble floor he had been cleaning earlier, as if nothing had happened. That quiet defiance, treating the billionaire's comment as irrelevant, made something burn hot and bitter in Benedict's chest. The guests shifted in their seats. Some smiled faintly, not at Benedict's remark, but at Elijah's indifference. Others glanced at each other in silent acknowledgement, as though a truth had just been revealed that none of them could unhear. "Of course," Benedict continued, raising his voice, "a party isn't a concert hall. Maybe next time we'll get you a real stage." He tried to inject a teasing warmth into his tone, but his words landed like cold ash. No one laughed. It was Marjorie Klein, socialite, art patron, and longtime admirer of Benedict's wealth, who finally broke the silence. "That," she said, her jeweled fingers clasped under her chin, "was extraordinary." Her voice trembled slightly, as though she were surprised by her own sincerity. Benedict's jaw tightened. "It was unexpected," he said, trying to reclaim the narrative. But Marjorie ignored him. She was already turning to Elijah. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, genuine curiosity softening her voice. Elijah paused his mopping. For a moment, Benedict thought the janitor would ignore her too, but then he looked up. "My mother taught me," he said simply, his tone steady, unembellished. Something about the simplicity of that answer seemed to land heavier than any speech could have. A few guests murmured quietly to each other, but their eyes stayed on Elijah, not Benedict. The billionaire's discomfort deepened. This was not how these gatherings were supposed to go. He was the one people came to see, to impress, to orbit around like planets around a star. And yet, here was a man in a faded work uniform who had done nothing but play a piano and somehow stolen every ounce of attention in the room. Benedict stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the marble with a sharp squeal. "Well," he announced, "I think that's enough excitement for tonight." But even as he tried to move the evening along, he could feel it, the shift was permanent. Elijah had played more than just music. He had cracked something. Something in the marble. Something in the carefully polished surface of Benedict's world. And once marble cracks, it never looks the same again. The Carlton estate emptied slowly that night. Guests slipped into their chauffeured cars, their conversations low and deliberate, as though they were carrying something fragile with them. It wasn't the usual post-party gossip, the predictable talk of who was wearing whom, who had signed which deal, who had drunk too much champagne. This was different. They spoke in fragments. That janitor? I've never heard. It wasn't just the music. Inside, Benedict lingered in the grand hall long after the last guest left. The piano sat untouched now, a black mirror reflecting the chandelier's light. He hated how it seemed to look at him, as if it knew something he didn't. From the far corner, Elijah quietly finished his shift. No rush, no acknowledgement of the performance, no attempt to bask in whatever strange attention it had brought him. He emptied the mop bucket, stored his tools, and slipped out the side door without a word. It was almost as if the moment at the piano had never happened, except that it had, and it was all anyone could think about. The next morning, whispers began to circulate in places Benedict couldn't control. The Carlton estate staff were the first to spread the story. Maids, butlers, security guards, cooks. They told it like a fable. How a man no one noticed sat at the piano and turned the air to gold. By noon, the story had leaked into the city's upper social circles. Some laughed at the idea. Others demanded to know if it was true. By the end of the week, Benedict was cornered at a board meeting by two directors' wives, both insisting they wanted Elijah to play at the upcoming charity gala. The mere suggestion made his jaw tighten. "He's a janitor," Benedict said flatly. "We have professional musicians for events like that." One of the women smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, professionals don't have what he has." That sentence stayed with him, gnawing at the back of his mind. What he has. It was a dangerous phrase. In Benedict's world, power was built on exclusivity, on being able to say you had something no one else could. But if a man like Elijah could walk into his world and have something untouchable, it meant his carefully guarded empire wasn't as secure as he thought. Meanwhile, Elijah's life outside the estate began to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. Strangers stopped him on the street. Not many, but enough to make him uneasy. A waitress at the corner diner asked if he really played, like they say. A mechanic he knew only in passing mentioned he'd heard about him from a cousin who cleaned at the estate. Even the neighborhood kids, usually busy with their own noise, started following him home, asking if he could teach them. Elijah didn't seek this. He didn't want this. For years, he had built a life on quiet survival, staying out of sight where it was safe. Attention, especially from people with power, wasn't a gift. It was a spotlight, and a spotlight could burn. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore. The way playing again had felt. That night at the piano had pulled something out of him he thought was gone forever. And now, in the quiet moments, he found himself hearing melodies in his head again. Sometimes, late at night, he even caught himself tapping rhythms on the kitchen table, his fingers remembering shapes they hadn't touched in years. Benedict, on the other hand, was already plotting. He told himself it wasn't jealousy, it was management. This was his estate, his world, and if a story like this kept spreading, it would take on a life of its own. And anything he couldn't control was a threat. By the time the invitation for the charity gala went out, it carried one subtle but deliberate omission. Elijah's name. The charity gala was Benedict Wellingham's masterpiece. Every year, he orchestrated it like a grand symphony of wealth, influence, and subtle power plays. The invitations were engraved, the guest list curated with surgical precision, and every detail, from the floral arrangements to the imported caviar, was meant to remind people of his dominance in the city's social hierarchy. This year, however, the air was different from the moment the first guest stepped onto the red carpet. The whispers from that fateful night still lingered, unspoken yet palpable. The grand hall gleamed as always, but behind the smiles and polite handshakes, there was an undercurrent. Will the janitor be here? Will he play again? Benedict had made certain the answer would be no. The evening's entertainment was already booked. A renowned string quartet flown in from Vienna, followed by a celebrated jazz pianist from New York. Flawless, expensive, respectable, everything Elijah Turner was not, at least in Benedict's mind. As the string quartet performed their opening set, the audience clapped with polite enthusiasm. The music was technically perfect, but there was no weight in it, no story. It floated above the crowd like fine perfume, pleasant but fleeting. Benedict noticed the difference. So did others. Halfway through the evening, Marjorie Klein approached him, her diamond necklace catching the light like a challenge. "Benedict," she said, "I can't help but notice your program is missing something, or rather, someone." He forced a smooth smile. "If you mean Turner, he's a janitor, Marjorie. We're not in the business of turning cleaning staff into concert headliners." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Sometimes, Benedict, greatness doesn't care about business." She left before he could reply. Meanwhile, Elijah was miles away, or so Benedict believed. The man had been assigned to work a different wing of the estate during the gala, away from the main hall, away from the piano. But fate, or maybe something else, rarely respects schedules. It happened when the jazz pianist, midway through his set, broke a string on the grand piano. The instrument, despite its beauty, was now unplayable without repair. A technician was called, but the nearest qualified one was an hour away. The guests, restless, began murmuring. That was when someone, no one could remember exactly who, suggested Elijah. At first, Benedict dismissed the idea with a sharp, "Absolutely not." But the murmurs grew louder. The janitor, the one from the other night. People began glancing toward the service doors, expecting him to walk through at any moment. In the kitchen, Elijah was quietly stacking dishes when a young server rushed in, breathless. They want you. Out there." He froze. "What for?" "The piano. They want you to play." Elijah shook his head. "That's not my place." The server swallowed hard. "It wasn't your place last time either. But you did it anyway." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, without another word, he wiped his hands on his apron and started walking. When Elijah entered the grand hall, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned. Even the string quartet, packing up their instruments, paused to watch. Benedict's expression hardened. "Turner, I didn't," but it was too late. Elijah was already at the piano. Elijah's fingers hovered momentarily above the piano keys as the room held its breath. The grand hall, usually alive with chatter and clinking glasses, had fallen into a heavy silence that pressed against every guest like a physical weight. Benedict's eyes burned into him, a storm barely restrained, but Elijah remained calm, unwavering. This was no longer about a bet or a joke. This was about reclaiming a piece of himself he thought had been lost forever. He closed his eyes briefly, grounding himself. Then, with a gentle touch, he began to play. The notes spilled out at first soft and hesitant, as if testing the waters of the room's consciousness. But with every passing second, the music grew bolder, more commanding. Elijah's hands danced across the keys with a fluidity that belied his years away from formal training. Each chord resonated deep in the listeners' souls, weaving a tapestry of stories of struggle, hope, and quiet resilience. At first, some guests exchanged puzzled glances. This was no polished recital by a famed concert pianist. This was something raw and real, a sound that told a story far beyond the boundaries of the grand hall. The music spoke of late nights, of battles fought in silence, of dreams kept alive against all odds. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Faces softened, eyes glistened with unshed tears. Even Benedict's rigid posture faltered, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his usual mask of dominance. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. Elijah's music had claimed that space, and no amount of wealth or power could wrest it away. The crescendo built with the rising tide of emotion. Guests leaned forward, captured by the haunting beauty pouring from the piano. The melodies wrapped around them, stripping away the layers of status and pretense, leaving only the raw humanity underneath. When Elijah's final note lingered and faded, the silence that followed was profound, an acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just unfolded. Then, like a wave-breaking, applause erupted. It started quietly, uncertainly, then grew into a thunderous ovation that shook the very walls. Marjorie Klein, tears shining in her eyes, was the first to rise, leading the standing ovation. Others followed, the social elite swept away by the undeniable power of Elijah's performance. Benedict remained seated, his jaw clenched, caught between fury and a grudging respect he couldn't voice. Elijah stood, bowed his head slightly, and retreated from the piano. The moment was his, but it was also a turning point. He had shattered the invisible barriers, forcing everyone in the room to confront truths they had long ignored. Outside, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into a movement. Elijah Turner was no longer just the janitor. He was a prodigy, a symbol of unexpected brilliance that could not be contained by social class or prejudice. And for Benedict Wellingham III, the man who had laughed at the challenge, this was the beginning of a reckoning. The echo of the applause still hung in the grand hall long after Elijah's final note had faded. Yet, the sound that truly resonated wasn't the clapping. It was the transformation that swept through every corner of that opulent room. The air was thick with disbelief, admiration, and something dangerously close to hope. A hope none of them expected to find amid crystal chandeliers and marble floors. Elijah made his way quietly toward the exit, avoiding eye contact, his heart pounding beneath the heavy fabric of his worn jacket. He hadn't sought the spotlight, yet here it was, casting its glare on a man who had spent years hiding in the shadows. The applause had felt like a balm, yes, but also a weight, a reminder that life was no longer going to be the same. Outside, the city had already begun to buzz with rumors. By morning, social media exploded with videos and photos taken secretly during the gala, clips of Elijah playing the piano with a passion that defied his humble title. Headlines appeared: Janitor's Genius Stuns Billionaire's Gala, From Mop to Maestro, and The Black Janitor Who Played Like a Prodigy. The story went viral faster than anyone anticipated. Benedict Wellingham III awoke the next day to the sharp sting of public opinion. His carefully constructed empire of influence was wobbling on a foundation that now included Elijah Turner, a man he had tried to erase but who refused to be forgotten. Calls poured in, journalists pressing for interviews, and socialites debating whether to embrace or shun the newfound sensation. In his office, surrounded by walls adorned with trophies of his past conquests, Benedict paced like a caged lion. His mind raced through strategies, damage control, and silent prayers to a world that didn't always favor the underdog. But there was one thing Benedict couldn't buy, threaten, or silence: the truth of Elijah's talent and the story behind it. Meanwhile, Elijah found himself at a crossroads. Invitations to perform at community centers, local theaters, and even prestigious venues arrived daily. Yet, with every opportunity came the weight of expectation. The janitor who had quietly carried his music for years was suddenly a beacon, a symbol for many who had been overlooked or underestimated. His humble apartment, once a refuge, became a gathering place for neighborhood kids eager to learn, neighbors who shared stories of their own struggles, and friends who encouraged him to embrace this new chapter. Elijah's music was no longer just a personal escape. It was a bridge connecting him to a larger world. Yet, amid the growing admiration, Elijah remained grounded. He remembered his mother's words, the early lessons from a battered church piano, and the pain that had once silenced his music. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it was filled with possibility. Back at the Carlton estate, the tension between Benedict and Elijah simmered just beneath the surface. Benedict could no longer dismiss Elijah as a mere janitor. He was now a force that challenged the old order. And as the city watched closely, the battle for control, respect, and recognition was only beginning. The days that followed Elijah's unforgettable performance at the gala were charged with electricity, a current running beneath the surface of the city's polished veneer. Whispers became conversations, conversations became debates, and debates reached the ears of powerful people who were unaccustomed to hearing anyone but themselves. Elijah found himself thrust into a world he had never sought, a world where his music was not just admired but dissected, where strangers asked for his story, where journalists wanted interviews. At first, he felt like a visitor in his own life, overwhelmed by attention and uncertain what to make of it all. The spotlight was blinding and uncomfortable, but it also illuminated a path he had long forgotten existed. Yet, for all the applause, there were shadows lurking just out of sight. Benedict Wellingham III was a man who had never lost a game. Every challenge had been met with cunning, every rival outmaneuvered with ease. But this was different. Elijah was not an opponent who played by the rules. He was a force that no amount of money or influence could easily suppress. In his vast office overlooking the city skyline, Benedict plotted. His carefully constructed world depended on control over narratives, reputations, and power. Elijah's rising star threatened to unravel everything. It was not merely a threat to his ego but to the very foundation upon which his empire was built. He summoned his closest advisors, men and women skilled in the art of damage control and influence. The plan was clear: to neutralize Elijah's rising influence before it could metastasize. But how does one silence a voice born from truth and passion? Meanwhile, Elijah remained largely unaware of the storm brewing behind closed doors. He focused on the music, on teaching the neighborhood kids, on the quiet moments where melody replaced the noise of doubt. But even as he played, he felt the weight of eyes watching him. Some filled with admiration, others with suspicion. The city became a battleground of narratives. Socialites whispered about the janitor who played like a genius, some lauding him as a symbol of hope, others dismissing him as a fleeting novelty. Benedict's allies circulated rumors, questioning Elijah's background, his motives, even his talent. It was a tactic as old as power itself, so doubt to weaken the rising star. Elijah, however, refused to be shaken. He remembered the lessons of his mother, the sanctuary of music, and the truth that spoke without words. The fight ahead was not just for his music or his dignity. It was for the voices of those like him who had been silenced for too long. And as the storm gathered strength, one thing became clear: neither Elijah nor Benedict would back down easily. The coming clash would test not only their talents and wills but the very fabric of a society built on invisible lines drawn between who belonged and who did not. The city's pulse quickened with every passing day, as if the very streets themselves sensed the brewing storm. Elijah Turner's rise had become impossible to ignore, a living testament to talent, resilience, and a refusal to be boxed in by society's cruel divisions. Yet, with visibility came vulnerability, and the lines between friend and foe began to blur. In the months following the gala, Elijah was thrust into a whirlwind of opportunities and challenges. Invitations to perform flooded in from concert halls and community centers alike. Each new stage was a chance to share his story without words, to let his music speak the truths others dared not voice. But every success carried the weight of expectations that threatened to suffocate. Behind the scenes, Benedict Wellingham III's campaign to regain control escalated. His tactics were subtle but relentless. Attempts to discredit Elijah began with whispered rumors, questioning the authenticity of his talent, speculating about his past, even planting seeds of doubt about his character. Benedict wielded influence like a scalpel, carving out cracks in Elijah's newfound reputation. But Elijah was no stranger to hardship. He faced the attacks with quiet dignity, drawing strength from memories of his mother's unwavering belief in him. Her words echoed in his mind: "Play the truth, no matter the noise around you." Each note he played was a refusal to be silenced. The public was caught in the crossfire. Many rallied behind Elijah, inspired by his journey from janitor to prodigy. Social media buzzed with support, hashtags trending worldwide, stories shared and reshared. Yet, there were detractors, those unwilling to see beyond class, race, and old prejudices. The tension reached a breaking point at a high-profile charity concert organized by Benedict himself, a calculated move to reclaim the narrative. He invited Elijah to perform, ostensibly as a gesture of goodwill, but with a clear intention: to expose him on a stage where the stakes were highest. Elijah accepted, aware that this would be the defining moment. The world was watching, some with hope, others with skepticism. The stage was set for a confrontation not just of music, but of values, identity, and power. As the night approached, Elijah prepared with the same focus and passion that had brought him this far. He knew that beyond the notes lay a message, one that transcended the keys, the audience, and the opulent surroundings. It was a message of truth, resilience, and undeniable humanity. When he stepped onto the stage, the spotlight was blinding. The hall was packed with elites, critics, and curious onlookers. Benedict sat in the front row, his gaze sharp and unyielding. The air was thick with anticipation, tension crackling like static. Elijah took a deep breath, sat at the piano, and let his fingers find the keys. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, before swelling into a powerful crescendo that filled every corner of the room. His music spoke of struggle and hope, pain and redemption. A story told without words but understood by all. The performance was nothing short of transformative. Some wept openly, others sat in stunned silence, while a few tried to mask their awe. Benedict's expression shifted from confident to unsettled, as if realizing that this was no ordinary recital. It was a reckoning. When the last note faded, the hall erupted in applause. This time, it was impossible to deny Elijah's place, not just as a musician, but as a force to be reckoned with. The applause thundered through the grand hall, yet beneath the roar was a silence far louder, the silence of a power shift no one dared to voice aloud. Elijah Turner had done more than just perform. He had ignited a spark that would not easily be extinguished. Benedict Wellingham III sat rigid in his seat, his mind racing. This was no longer a battle of money or influence. It was a battle of hearts and minds. The elite had seen Elijah not as a janitor, but as a man whose music bled truth. And that truth, raw and unvarnished, threatened the very foundation of Benedict's carefully curated world. As the final notes echoed in the hall, Benedict's control began to slip. Guests who had once fawned over him now exchanged glances filled with newfound respect for Elijah. The invisible barriers of class and race trembled, threatening to collapse. But Benedict was a strategist. His fury fueled a resolve to fight back, not with brute force, but with subtlety. He knew that to regain his empire, he needed to rewrite the narrative, to plant doubt where certainty had taken root. Outside the gala, Elijah felt the weight of expectation settle heavily on his shoulders. His phone buzzed incessantly. Interviews, offers, and invitations flooded in. The world was watching, waiting to see what the janitor turned prodigy would do next. Yet amidst the chaos, Elijah found solace in the quiet corners of his life. The worn piano in his small apartment, the encouraging smiles of neighborhood children eager to learn, the memories of his mother's gentle guidance. These were his anchors, reminding him who he was beyond the spotlight. Back at the Carlton estate, Benedict convened his inner circle. Plans were laid: smear campaigns, strategic alliances, and subtle manipulations designed to weaken Elijah's rising influence. He would use every tool at his disposal to protect his world. But Elijah was not alone. A growing movement had begun, fueled by those inspired by his story. Musicians, activists, everyday people yearning for change. They rallied around him, their voices rising in chorus, demanding recognition not just for Elijah, but for all those overlooked and underestimated. The battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just a story about a piano or a bet. It was a struggle for dignity, respect, and the right to be seen and heard. And as the city braced for what was to come, one truth stood clear. Elijah Turner's music was more than notes and melodies. It was a revolution in sound, a call to shatter old walls and build new bridges. In the days that followed the gala, Elijah Turner's name became a beacon of hope and defiance. News outlets couldn't get enough of the janitor who had turned a billionaire's world upside down with nothing but music and raw talent. His story was retold endlessly, inspiring thousands who saw in him the possibility of breaking free from the invisible chains of society. Elijah's life transformed rapidly. Invitations to perform at prestigious venues arrived alongside humble requests from community centers and schools eager to host him. The man who once swept floors found himself on stages he had only dreamed about, and yet, through it all, he remained grounded, never forgetting the narrow apartment where he grew up, or the battered church piano where his mother had taught him to play the truth. Yet the spotlight also brought new challenges. Benedict Wellingham III was relentless, employing every tactic to undermine Elijah's rising influence. Rumors were spread quietly at first, casting shadows over Elijah's character and questioning the authenticity of his talent. Influential voices whispered doubts in social circles, aiming to fracture the growing support around the prodigy. But Elijah's resilience was fortified by community and conviction. Neighborhood children gathered at his apartment, their eager faces lighting up as he taught them to find their own voices through music. Friends, old and new, rallied to his side, reminding him that he was not alone in this fight. The city itself seemed to shift with Elijah's rise. Walls that had once separated classes and colors began to show cracks. Conversations started in living rooms and cafes, questioning long-held prejudices and imagining a world where talent and heart mattered more than wealth and status. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at a local theater, Elijah sat backstage, exhausted but fulfilled. A young girl approached him, clutching a small, worn notebook. "Mr. Turner," she said shyly, "I want to play like you someday." He smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then start by playing your own truth, no matter what anyone else says." Meanwhile, Benedict faced mounting pressure. His attempts to silence Elijah only fueled the prodigy's rise, and the city's elite were divided. Some clung to old power structures, while others saw in Elijah a new symbol of possibility. The battle for the city's soul was no longer a quiet undercurrent. It was a rising tide, unstoppable and inevitable. And Elijah Turner, once invisible, was now its leading voice. The momentum Elijah had built was undeniable. His music had transcended the gilded halls of the elite and seeped into the very heart of the city's diverse communities. Yet with every step forward, the barriers he faced became more complex, layered with unspoken prejudice and the weight of history. Elijah's performances were no longer mere concerts. They became gatherings of hope and resilience. Venues filled with faces eager to witness the man who had defied expectations. Children, adults, and elders alike found solace and inspiration in his melodies, which spoke of pain, perseverance, and the possibility of change. But the higher Elijah climbed, the harder the resistance pushed back. Benedict Wellingham III, refusing to yield, intensified his efforts to discredit Elijah. He funded covert campaigns questioning the legitimacy of Elijah's background, sowing doubt about his upbringing and casting shadows on his character. The aim was clear: to make the public question whether Elijah was truly the prodigy they believed him to be. Despite the barrage, Elijah's integrity remained intact. He chose transparency, inviting journalists into his world. His small apartment, the worn piano, the neighborhood that raised him. Through interviews and candid conversations, he revealed not only his talent, but the journey that had forged it. The city responded. Supporters organized benefit concerts, social media campaigns, and grassroots movements advocating for recognition of Elijah and others like him. His story became a catalyst for a broader conversation about inequality, opportunity, and the power of art to unite. In the midst of this whirlwind, Elijah found moments of quiet reflection. He often returned to the church piano where his mother had first taught him, finding peace in its familiar keys. Those sessions were reminders of where he came from and why his music mattered. Benedict, however, grew increasingly isolated. His allies questioned the wisdom of fighting a man whose story resonated so deeply. Some began to distance themselves, sensing that the tide was turning against the old order. One evening, during a private meeting, Benedict's trusted advisor warned, "You're facing more than a man with a piano. This is a movement." Benedict's jaw clenched. Then it's time to decide: adapt or be left behind. As Elijah's influence continued to rise, the city found itself at a crossroads. The struggle was no longer just about a piano or a bet. It was about breaking barriers, seen and unseen, and forging a new future. Elijah Turner's story had become a beacon for many, a shining light cutting through the darkness of forgotten dreams and unspoken truths. But beneath the surface of his newfound fame lay echoes of a past that refused to be silenced. Late one evening, in the quiet of his modest apartment, Elijah sat at the worn piano that had been his mother's legacy. His fingers traced the familiar keys, but his mind wandered to the memories that haunted him. the struggles of his childhood, the sacrifices his mother had made, and the pain of losing the only person who truly believed in him. His journey had never been easy. Every note he played was infused with the weight of those experiences, the triumphs and the scars alike. Music was not just an escape. It was a testament to survival, a language for emotions too deep for words. As the city celebrated Elijah's rise, old wounds stirred. Questions about his past resurfaced, some genuine, others weaponized by those who sought to undermine him. Rumors spread in dark corners, attempting to paint a picture that was far from the truth. But Elijah faced these shadows head-on. In interviews and public appearances, he spoke candidly about his upbringing, the poverty, the prejudice, the moments of doubt, and how they had shaped the man he had become. His honesty resonated, drawing even more supporters who saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. One day, a letter arrived, handwritten on fragile paper. It was from an old friend of his mother's, someone Elijah had never met but who had watched his journey from afar. The letter spoke of his mother's pride, her unwavering faith in his talent, and a secret she had kept, a piece of music she had composed, never shared with anyone. The discovery of this lost composition ignited a new chapter in Elijah's story. It was a bridge between past and present, a gift from the woman who had set him on this path. As Elijah learned to play the piece, he felt a connection deeper than words, a reminder that his music was part of a legacy much greater than himself. Meanwhile, Benedict's efforts to contain Elijah's influence grew desperate. His campaigns lost traction as the public's affection for Elijah deepened. The old guard faced a reckoning, forced to confront a changing world where talent and truth could no longer be silenced by status or wealth. Elijah stood at the forefront of this transformation, his music echoing not just in concert halls, but in the hearts of those yearning for change. Elijah Turner's life was a melody composed over years of hardship, hope, and relentless determination. With the discovery of his mother's secret composition, a new chapter unfolded, one that bridged the past shadows with the promise of the future. The fragile sheet music, yellowed with age and inscribed in delicate handwriting, was more than notes on paper. It was a message, a testament to a woman whose love had nurtured a prodigy in the midst of struggle. As Elijah practiced the piece, each chord resonated with a warmth that felt like a mother's embrace, a whispered encouragement from beyond. His performances began to incorporate this new piece, weaving it seamlessly into his repertoire. Audiences were captivated, not only by his talent but by the story carried within the music. It was a legacy reclaimed, a gift shared with the world. Yet, as Elijah's star ascended, the challenges intensified. Benedict Wellingham III's attempts to undermine him grew more cunning, shifting from outright attacks to subtle manipulations. Behind closed doors, Benedict brokered deals and alliances, seeking to preserve his influence in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to his power. Elijah, however, refused to be daunted. His journey was no longer just his own. It was a beacon for those who had been overlooked, underestimated, and silenced. Each performance was a declaration, a celebration of resilience and the transformative power of art. Community centers overflowed with eager students inspired by Elijah's story. Neighborhoods once forgotten began to pulse with new energy, their voices lifted in song and hope. Elijah's music became a movement, a catalyst for change that transcended notes and rhythms. Benedict watched from the sidelines, his empire cracking beneath the weight of a shifting world. The once unassailable billionaire was forced to reckon with the reality that money and status could not contain a truth as powerful as Elijah's music. In a rare moment of reflection, Benedict confronted the inevitable. The city was changing, and so was he. The battle had revealed a deeper truth, that power, when wielded without empathy, was fragile, and that genuine talent and authenticity held a strength that could not be bought or bartered. Elijah's journey, from the quiet halls of the Carlton estate to stages that spanned the city, was far from over. But one thing was certain. He had reclaimed not just a legacy, but a voice that would echo through generations. The city awoke to a new rhythm. The winds of change swept through the streets and alleyways, carrying with them the echoes of Elijah Turner's music. What had started as a quiet defiance, a single voice rising from the shadows, was now a chorus swelling with power and purpose. Elijah's performances had become more than just concerts. They were gatherings of community, hope, and resilience. Crowds flocked to venues both grand and humble, united by the shared experience of his melodies. His music told stories, stories of pain and joy, loss and redemption, struggle and triumph. At the heart of this movement was Elijah himself, a man transformed by his journey. He had grown from a hidden janitor into a symbol of possibility, a beacon for those who dared to dream beyond their circumstances. Yet, he remained grounded, his humility a testament to the values instilled in him by his mother's love. Benedict Wellingham III, once a titan of industry and social standing, now found himself at a crossroads. The old strategies of control and manipulation faltered in the face of this new reality. His empire, built on wealth and influence, was crumbling beneath the weight of truth and authenticity. In private moments, Benedict wrestled with the changing world. He saw that power was no longer a commodity to be wielded without conscience. There was a lesson in Elijah's rise, a call to recognize the humanity in others, to listen to voices long silenced. Meanwhile, Elijah continued to inspire. He opened a music school in his neighborhood, providing opportunities for children who, like him, had few resources but abundant dreams. The school became a sanctuary, a place where talent could flourish regardless of background. The city's fabric was being rewoven. Old divisions softened as people from different walks of life came together, united by a shared appreciation for music and the stories it told. Elijah's legacy was not just in his notes but in the bridges he built between communities. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Elijah stood on a stage overlooking a packed crowd. The air was thick with anticipation. He took a deep breath, fingers poised above the keys, and began to play, a melody that spoke of a new dawn, of hope, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. And as the notes soared into the night, the city listened, changed, awakened, and ready to embrace the future. Elijah Turner's story had transcended the boundaries of music and class, becoming a symbol of resilience and change. His music school thrived, nurturing talents from neighborhoods long forgotten, a living testament to the power of opportunity and belief. With every performance, Elijah inspired not only his students but the city itself. He spoke openly about the barriers he faced, the prejudices he battled, and the love that kept him moving forward. His authenticity drew people in, bridging divides that once seemed unbreakable. Benedict Wellingham III, witnessing the unstoppable momentum, began to see cracks not just in his empire but in himself. The relentless fight to maintain control gave way to moments of doubt and reflection. Conversations with old friends and advisors made him realize that power without purpose was empty. As Elijah's music filled concert halls and street corners alike, a new conversation blossomed in the city about equality, respect, and the redefinition of success. The janitor who had played a piano like a prodigy was now a leader of a quiet revolution. Elijah knew the road ahead was still long. There would be new challenges, critics, and obstacles, but he faced them with a heart full of hope and a mind steady in purpose. His journey was no longer just personal. It was collective. He was not alone. Years later, Elijah stood on the grand stage of the city's largest concert hall. The auditorium was packed, a sea of faces illuminated by soft lights, each one waiting to witness a moment decades in the making. Tonight was more than a performance. It was a celebration. Of music, of dreams, of battles won and scars healed. Elijah's fingers hovered above the keys one last time, a smile touching his lips as memories flooded back. The struggle, the losses, the love, the laughter. He began to play. The music poured out, rich, vibrant, filled with the depth of a life fully lived. Each note told a story, the innocence of childhood, the pain of loss, the fire of determination, and the beauty of triumph. The audience was spellbound, tears and smiles mingling in the quiet reverence. When the final chord resonated and faded into silence, the crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. But Elijah knew the true applause was not out there. It was within him, a quiet acknowledgement of a journey completed and a legacy secured. Backstage, Benedict watched from the wings, his face unreadable. He approached Elijah, extending a hand. "You've changed everything," he said simply. Elijah took the hand, nodding. "And we're just getting started." Outside, the city breathed easier, its walls softened by music and hope. Elijah's story was no longer just about one man. It was about the power of courage, truth, and the unyielding human spirit. And in that final note, the world heard not just a melody, but a promise. That no matter where you start, greatness is possible when you play your truth.